Hello, everybody. This is Susan Kokinda with your Midweek Update. Today is August 21st. So here we are in the middle of the Democratic Convention. I was going to describe it as a new Steven Spielberg production called Indiana Jones and the Saviors of Democracy, with Kamala Harris replacing Harrison Ford and Tim Walz replacing various leading ladies. But Niall Ferguson over at the Free Press on Substack has come up with a much, much better image, namely that this is Barbenheimer, referring to the two competing Hollywood blockbusters back in 2023, which came out around the same time. So Kamala Harris and the Democrats certainly channel the bubblegum pink dream house world of Barbie, which came out around the same time as the movie about Robert Oppenheimer and the creation of the atom bomb. Ferguson writes that Trump's interview with Elon Musk last week was very Oppenheimer, with Trump's stark warning about nuclear war. Trump said to Musk, the biggest threat is not global warming. The biggest threat is nuclear warming. And he warned of the various hotspots that could lead to World War III, including the Mideast. He said, we have numerous places that could end up in World War III right now for no reason whatsoever. The fact that war in the Middle East is on the verge of going out of control, and the fact that NATO, in the form of the Ukrainian incursion, has in essence invaded Russia, is very real, as are the dangers. I guess the fact that it is real is why it hasn't factored into the DNC programming. So last night we heard from the casting directors for the Barbie production, namely Barack and Michelle Obama. Tonight we'll feature Bill Clinton and Tim Walz before we get to Barbie/Kamala herself tomorrow night. I'm going to leave it to Barbara Boyd and her Saturday wrap-up to give more of an overview. That is, after the final balloons have dropped and the walls which are surrounding the convention, protecting them from protesters, have been taken down. I encourage you to sign up on Promethean Action to receive this and all the rest of our extremely important coverage. But in this update, I want to take a step back and make the point that it is important to view these events not through the lens of political party, but through a different lens. Now, that's pretty hard to do in the middle of a party convention and a presidential election, which is by its nature partisan. But this does have to be looked at through the lens of something deeper. What is playing out before us is a battle between two systems and two images of man. On the one hand, you have the imperial or the British system. On the other, you have a world based on sovereign nations, respecting each other's sovereignty and figuring out how to work with each other on the basis of mutual interest. And that is the American system approach to foreign policy. The two images of man are even more stark. The image of man shared by our founders and many other cultures in the world is one which celebrates man's creative potential, our uniqueness as creatures of mind and intellect, who act in partnership with a creative universe under God. The other image denigrates us to the level of beasts. We're defined by our physical characteristics and our passions, my body. Nothing screams that latter definition louder than the Planned Parenthood mobile health clinic at the convention, which is offering free vasectomies and free chemical abortions. The appointments for vasectomies have apparently been overbooked. I guess that's one way to get rid of the patriarchy. Apparently, there is also a 6-foot inflatable IUD birth control device on display in the convention area. So on Monday, the Democrats took the 2 minutes of hate from George Orwell's 1984 novel and turned it into 6 hours of Trump derangement syndrome. And then they did it again on Tuesday. As the Trump campaign pointed out, on the first night, Trump was mentioned over 100 times, and inflation was mentioned 3 times. Now, Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, are talking about inflation and the economy and jobs. On Monday, the day the Democratic convention opened, Trump spoke at a precision machining company in York, Pennsylvania, and he elaborated on his economic policies and focused on producing our way out of the economic collapse with real physical economic growth. In the course of that speech, he put forward several really bold new proposals. He addressed the inflation crisis from the standpoint of producing, and especially producing more energy, and by doing so, cutting the cost of energy in half in 12 months. He spoke of opening up dozens and dozens of new power plants, including clean coal, natural gas, and nuclear. In a new initiative, he called for the rapid commercialization and use of small modular nuclear reactors, which could potentially provide quantities of high-quality energy quickly. He also spoke about using the Defense Production Act, which does mean that the government intervenes to get things done to reestablish domestic supply lines in critical areas. This is all classic American system economics. My colleague Brian Lantz took an additional look at Trump's policies in our Monday strategic overview and contrasted them to Kamala's latest round of insane hyperinflationary proposals, which are as unworkable as they are destructive. Harris, in essence, represents the left-wing version of British monetarist policies, that is, spend money on everything, while the Heritage Foundation and much of their Project 2025 represents the right wing of British monetarist policies, i.e., don't spend money on anything unless it's bailing out the financier class. The Democratic Convention's subplot of bashing Agenda 2025 over and over again is just a way of orchestrating the two sides of the same system. Meanwhile, over in the real world, Trump is talking about the American system. Now, by way of looking a little more deeply into the historical backdrop of this fight between the two systems, I want to take a look at the introduction to the Democratic Party platform and the Republican Party platform. First, the Democrats. Quote, "The Democratic National Committee wishes to acknowledge that we gather together to state our values on lands that have been stewarded through many centuries by the ancestors and descendants of tribal nations," unquote. They cite the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and 6 or 7 other tribes. Shockingly, they fail to acknowledge the Clovis people and the Denisovans who were here before all those other tribes. On the other hand, the Republican platform recognizes that something else happened on this land, that here was born a new form of government, the great constitutional republic of the United States. And the opening page of the Republican platform is a simple dedication to the forgotten men and women of America. Now, I want to take a special note of that, and who else used that phrase. Franklin Roosevelt used that phrase in a 1932 speech before he became president. He was addressing those Americans who had been left in the dust, literally, by the financial oligarchy. It's an interesting speech because in it he attacks the idea that, quote, "huge expenditure of funds," unquote, by the government is not going to solve the problem. He recognized that we had to get Americans actually working and producing again, just as Trump does. I hope that ruffles a few feathers out there, because Donald Trump has much more in common with FDR's intentions and JFK's intentions than most understand. And this gets back to the nature of the two systems in conflict. At the end of World War II, FDR challenged Winston Churchill in one of their final summits. He said, "Winston, we are not fighting this war to bring back British 18th century methods." He said, "We want American methods, which will allow nations to develop as we have and not be at the mercy of empires, or today, at the mercy of global corporations or central banks." American methods were to be the basis of the post-war Bretton Woods system, which did last until 1971. Last week, on August 15th, we marked the anniversary of the 1971 decision forced upon Richard Nixon, basically by the Bank of England, to end the Bretton Woods system and take the dollar off the gold reserve standard. Way back then, I heard a man named Lyndon LaRouche warn that that decision would put us on a path toward fascism. I understood his arguments, that this was a first step in surrendering economic sovereignty to an imperial financier elite, and that by doing that, we would see the destruction of our economy, of our industry, of our living standards, to the point that those elites would have to use fascist methods to keep us under control. 2 weeks ago in the Midweek Update, I spoke about how the Rockefeller interests floated the phrase fascism with a democratic face back in the 1970s. But I have to say that despite understanding it intellectually, I couldn't imagine back in 1971 that the U.S. would ever be threatened by fascism. And here we are today. In the case of Camelot, we can call it fascism with a communist face. But of course, there has been a disruption in that drive, in the person of Donald Trump. And that disruption is now expanded to include other elements like J.D. Vance and the brilliant new Republican Party platform, authored largely by Donald Trump, which opens the door to the reestablishment of the American system. We're calling it the American System 2.0. The Hollywood scripts, the propaganda, the Psy-war, the lawfare, the brainwashing, it actually doesn't work when people are grounded in the real world and when courageous leaders provide them with actual solutions. So my recommendation to you for the next couple of days is ignore the crap coming out of Chicago. Go to Trump's website, donaldjtrump.com, read the platform, download it, and organize with it. That's your Midweek Update. Thanks for listening.
Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at prometheanaction.com.